The security alarm screamed through the diplomatic station as the Vraxian war beast tore through its containment field. Commander Jake Morrison watched in horror as the creature, easily 15 feet tall with scales like obsidian armor and eyes that burned with ancient fury, crashed into the main hall where the peace summit was taking place. Delegates from 12 different species scrambled for cover, their translators filling the air with panicked shrieks in a dozen languages. The Vraxian ambassador, a smaller member of the species but still imposing at 9 feet, stood frozen in terror. His people had brought the dragon as a symbol of their military might, a living reminder of why humanity should accept their terms without question. Now that symbol was free, and its rage was palpable. Jake's hand moved to his sidearm, but he knew it was useless. Standard plasma rounds would bounce off those scales like raindrops. The dragon had already killed 3 Kelthian guards with a single sweep of its clawed hand. Their bodies lay twisted near the entrance, smoke rising from cauterized wounds. The creature's roar shook the station's metal framework. It was a sound that carried death in every vibration, a promise of violence that had echoed across 1,000 conquered worlds. The Vraxians had bred these beasts for war, enhancing them with genetic modifications until they became perfect killing machines. This one had ended entire rebellions single-handedly. Lieutenant Amy Chen burst through the side door, her daughter clutching her hand. Jake's stomach dropped. Civilians weren't supposed to be anywhere near this section, but the lockdown had trapped them during a tour of the station. The little girl, maybe 5 years old with pigtails and a bright yellow dress, stared at the chaos with wide eyes. The dragon's head snapped toward the movement. Its nostrils flared, tasting the air. Then it moved with terrifying speed for something so massive. Amy shoved her daughter behind a support column and raised her own weapon, but the dragon batted it away effortlessly. The impact sent Amy flying into a wall where she crumpled, unconscious. The child Sophie stepped out from behind the column. She should have been screaming. Every instinct programmed by millions of years of evolution should have had her running in blind panic. Instead, she walked forward with the curious fearlessness that only human children possessed, that strange quality that made them pet venomous creatures and befriend predators. The dragon lowered its massive head, bringing its face level with the tiny human. Its breath came in hot gusts that rustled Sophie's hair. Jake could see its muscles tensing, preparing to strike. He started moving, knowing he'd never reach her in time, but unable to stand still. Sophie reached up with both hands and placed them on the dragon's snout. The creature went absolutely still. The entire hall held its breath. Then the little girl did something that would be replayed on news feeds across 50 star systems. She stood on her toes and kissed the dragon's scaled nose. The silence that followed was profound. The dragon's eyes, which had burned with mindless fury moments before, suddenly showed something else. Confusion! Then something that looked almost like wonder. Its massive body relaxed, muscles uncoiling from their attack posture. It made a sound, not a roar this time, but something softer, almost questioning. Sophie giggled and patted the dragon's face. The deadliest creature in known space, the nightmare that had ended civilizations, lowered itself to the ground and let a human child scratch behind its horned ears. The war ended 3 months later, not with treaties or weapons, but with a simple video that spread across the galaxy. The Vraxians, who had built their empire on fear and the might of their dragons, watched as their ultimate weapon became gentle under a child's touch. Other species saw it too and understood something fundamental about humans that no amount of diplomatic posturing could have conveyed. Humans weren't the strongest species or the smartest or the most technologically advanced, but they possessed something unique, something that defied logic and calculation. They could look at a monster and see potential for friendship. They could face death without fear and respond with kindness. That innocence, that stubborn refusal to accept that something was beyond redemption, made them more dangerous to an empire built on terror than any weapon ever could. The Vraxian ambassador approached Jake 3 days after the incident. The dragon, now called Ember by Sophie, who visited it daily, lay contentedly in a hastily constructed habitat. The ambassador's translator carried a tone Jake had never heard from the typically proud species. They wanted to know how humanity had done it. How had a child accomplished what their finest trainers spent years achieving? How had she looked at certain death and chosen love? Jake didn't have an answer. He'd watched his own species charge into battles they couldn't win, sacrifice themselves for strangers, and adopt creatures that should have eaten them. Humanity's greatest strength had always been its greatest mystery. They were simultaneously the most violent and most compassionate species in the galaxy, capable of both terrible destruction and impossible kindness, often in the same moment. The peace talks resumed the next week. This time, the Vraxians came without weapons or threats. They came with questions. They wanted to understand the species that could tame dragons with kisses. They wanted to learn from people who taught their children that monsters were just friends they hadn't made yet. Sophie continued her visits to Ember, completely unaware that she'd changed the course of galactic history. She'd bring drawings she'd made in school and tell the dragon about her day. Ember would listen, making soft rumbling sounds that researchers swore carried emotional content. The beast that had torn through reinforced steel now carefully held crayons in its claws, trying to color within the lines of the pictures Sophie brought. Other dragons were brought to the station carefully and with extensive safety protocols. Each one met Sophie and her growing group of human children who'd volunteered to help. Each time, the result was the same. The creatures that had terrorized the galaxy for generations became docile, even playful, under the attention of human youngsters. Scientists scrambled to explain it. Was it pheromones? Some undiscovered psychic ability? A frequency in human children's voices? The truth was simpler and more profound. Humans, especially young ones, hadn't learned to fear what they were supposed to fear. They approached the universe with open hearts and assumed the best until proven wrong. That assumption, that willingness to offer trust first and ask questions later, bypassed every defense mechanism the dragons possessed. They'd been bred to fight warriors and resist weapons. Nobody had prepared them for unconditional acceptance. The galaxy watched and learned. Species that had prepared for war with humanity reconsidered. The humans weren't naive or weak. They'd proven themselves capable warriors in the past. But they chose peace first, every time. They chose to see potential rather than threat. And, somehow, impossibly, the universe bent to accommodate that choice. Jake Morrison stood in the observation deck, watching Sophie and a dozen other children playing with creatures that could have destroyed the station with ease. Amy, recovered from her injuries, stood beside him. Her hand rested on his shoulder as they witnessed something unprecedented in galactic history. The dragons, the galaxy's most feared weapons, had become humanity's most devoted friends. And it had started with a kiss from a 5-year-old girl who didn't know she was supposed to be afraid. Commander Jake Morrison filed his report 3 weeks after the incident, but words failed to capture what had truly happened. The footage spoke volumes that text never could. The Galactic Council had watched it repeatedly, each viewing revealing new details that defied their understanding of how the universe worked. The Vraxian delegation sat in stunned silence as species after species demanded to know humanity's secret. There was no secret. That was what terrified the other races more than anything else. Humans simply approached danger differently. Their children, unburdened by the survival instincts that kept other species alive, walked toward death with curiosity instead of fear. It should have been a fatal flaw. Evolution should have selected against it millennia ago. Instead, it had become humanity's greatest weapon in a galaxy built on fear and strength. The research teams arrived within days, led by Dr. Patricia Hayes, a xenobiologist who specialized in cross-species behavioral studies. She set up equipment around Ember's habitat, recording every interaction between Sophie and the dragon. The data she collected would change everything science thought it knew about apex predators and their responses to perceived threats. Ember's brain scans showed something remarkable. When Sophie approached, the dragon's amygdala, the fear and aggression center, went almost dormant. Meanwhile, regions associated with social bonding and parental instincts lit up like a supernova. The child's presence literally rewired the beast's threat assessment protocols. Patricia theorized it was linked to human children's unique combination of vulnerability and fearlessness. The dragon's instincts recognized something helpless but not prey, curious but not challenging. Other species had young that triggered protective instincts, but they also displayed appropriate fear responses. Human children walked up to the galaxy's deadliest creatures and petted them. That behavior bypassed every evolutionary safeguard in the dragon's mind. It couldn't attack something that refused to see it as an enemy. The cognitive dissonance overwhelmed its training and genetic programming. The Vraxian Empire began to crumble within weeks. Not from war or rebellion, but from a crisis of identity. Their entire civilization had been built on the principle that might determined right, that fear ensured obedience. Humanity had just proven that kindness could be stronger than terror. Worlds that had submitted to Vraxian rule began asking uncomfortable questions. If dragons could be gentle, what else had they been told that was a lie? Ambassador Krell, the Vraxian who had brought the dragon to the summit, requested a private meeting with Jake. They met in a small conference room with Sophie present at Krell's insistence. The massive alien knelt before the child, his ceremonial armor scraping against the floor. When he spoke, his translator couldn't quite capture the emotion in his native language. His people had been wrong. They had taken creatures capable of love and turned them into weapons. They had suppressed the dragon's natural social behaviors and forced them into aggression. The Vraxians had believed they were creating tools of war. Instead, they'd been torturing sentient beings for generations. Sophie had revealed that truth in a single innocent gesture. Krell asked if Sophie would help his people learn. Not just about dragons, but about the philosophy that let humans see friends where others saw monsters. Jake wanted to refuse. His daughter had already done enough. She'd already changed the galaxy. But Sophie looked up at the towering alien with those wide, fearless eyes and asked if they had any baby dragons she could meet. The transformation began immediately. Vraxian dragon breeding facilities, once resembling prisons, were redesigned based on human child care centers. The dragons needed socialization, play, and affection. They needed to be treated as people, not weapons. Human volunteers, mostly children supervised by xenopsychologists, traveled to Vraxian worlds to help with the process. The results were staggering. Dragons that had been violent and unstable became calm and even protective. They formed bonds with their Vraxian handlers that went beyond master and beast. They became partners, friends, family. The entire structure of Vraxian society had to adapt. An empire built on dominance through fear couldn't function when its primary tool of terror wanted to play fetch and receive belly rubs. Lieutenant Amy Chen returned to active duty but found her role had changed. She was now the commanding officer of the 1st Human-Dragon Relations Unit, a diplomatic corps that existed solely to help other species understand what Sophie had accidentally taught the galaxy. Her team traveled to worlds where similar apex predators had been militarized, showing them that there were alternatives to violence. The mission to the Korthax homeworld proved the most challenging. Their predators, massive serpentine creatures called renders, made Vraxian dragons look tame. They'd been engineered for centuries to be nearly unstoppable, capable of burrowing through solid rock and surviving in vacuum. The Korthax military used them to break sieges and terrorize populations into submission. Amy's team arrived with 12 human children, Sophie among them, and a dozen adult handlers. The Korthax military commander, General Voss, met them with barely concealed contempt. He'd seen the footage from the space station. He'd watched a human child kiss a dragon. It meant nothing. Renders were different. They had no capacity for gentleness. They were pure predation given form. The first render they brought out had killed 6 handlers in the past month. It was scheduled for termination. Instead, it found itself surrounded by small humans who should have been terrified. Sophie walked right up to its cage, ignoring the warnings shouted in multiple languages. The render's segmented body rippled with muscle as it moved toward the bars. Its mouth, filled with rows of rotating teeth designed to bore through armor, opened wide. Sophie stuck her hand through the bars and booped its nose. The render froze. Then it made a sound nobody had ever heard from its species before. Something between a purr and a chirp, high-pitched and almost playful. Within an hour, it was out of its cage, wrapped around the children like a massive scaly blanket, perfectly content. General Voss watched his unbeatable weapon become a jungle gym for alien children. His expression went through denial, anger, and finally something like grief. His entire military doctrine had just been invalidated by a 5-year-old saying the creature was cute and asking if it wanted to play. The pattern repeated across the galaxy. Every species that had weaponized its apex predators found the same result. Human children, with their inexplicable fearlessness and infinite capacity for affection, could pacify anything. It wasn't mind control, or pheromones, or psychic abilities. It was simply the power of choosing kindness when every instinct screamed for violence. Back on the diplomatic station, Sophie's fame had grown to the point where security had to manage crowds of aliens who wanted to meet her. She handled it with the same casual grace she'd shown the dragon. She didn't understand why everyone thought she was special. She'd just been nice to something that looked sad and scary. "Wasn't that what you were supposed to do, Dr. Hayes published her findings in the Galactic Journal of Xenobiology. The paper, titled Fearless Affection, Human Juvenile Behavior as a Catalyst for Apex Predator Social Bonding, became the most downloaded scientific document in history. Universities across the galaxy added it to required reading lists. Military academies used it to teach cadets that there were threats beyond physical violence. The true impact became clear 6 months after Sophie kissed Ember. The Vraxian Empire officially dissolved, restructuring itself into the Vraxian Coalition. Dragons were granted sapient rights. They had language, it turned out, just not one their handlers had bothered to learn. With human linguists and dragon cooperation, a translation matrix was developed. The first thing the dragons communicated was gratitude towards Sophie and a question. Why had humans helped them when no one else had? Jake found himself in the strange position of explaining human nature to a room full of dragons and their Vraxian partners. He told them about humanity's history, about how humans had once hunted wolves nearly to extinction before deciding to befriend them instead. How they'd turned predators into pets and pets into family. How humans had an almost pathological need to nurture things, even things that could kill them. The dragons listened with an intensity that their handlers said indicated deep thought. When Jake finished, the eldest dragon, a creature called Ancient Scar by the Vraxians, spoke through the translator. Its words were simple, but profound. Humans were pack animals who saw every living thing as potential pack. That wasn't naivety or weakness. It was the most aggressive form of social warfare the galaxy had ever seen. Humans didn't conquer through violence. They conquered through friendship, and that was far harder to resist. Sophie continued visiting Ember daily, unaware of the philosophical discussions her actions had sparked. She brought new friends sometimes, human and alien children, who'd heard about the dragon and wanted to meet it. Ember greeted each one with gentle curiosity, careful not to harm the fragile beings who showed it such affection. The dragon had learned human words, simple ones, that Sophie taught it. Friend, play, happy, love. The galactic community struggled to adapt to this new reality. Species that had prepared for war with humanity found themselves disarmed by kindergarten teachers and field trips. The human government, initially overwhelmed by the sudden shift in interstellar relations, eventually created the Department of Interspecies Harmony. Its primary mission was to facilitate contact between human children and misunderstood apex predators across the galaxy. Critics argued it was dangerous, irresponsible, essentially using children as diplomatic shields. But the statistics were undeniable. Not a single human child had been harmed in these encounters. The creatures being labeled as monsters uniformly chose gentleness when faced with innocent curiosity. It was as if the galaxy's predators had been waiting for someone to see them as something other than threats. Amy Chen led a mission to the Obsidian Reach, a region of space where 3 different apex predator species competed for dominance. The resulting violence had made the area nearly uninhabitable for the client species caught in the middle. Her team included 15 children and their families, all volunteers who understood the risks and chose to help anyway. They started with the Shardlings, crystalline creatures that could shatter starship hulls with sonic screams. The local population warned them to maintain distance, to use protective equipment, to treat the creatures as the weapons they were. Instead, Sophie and her friends played a game of catch with light refracted through the Shardlings' bodies. The creatures joined in, learning to modulate their vocalizations to create musical notes instead of destructive frequencies. Next came the Devourers, insectoid beings the size of shuttles that consumed organic matter at terrifying speeds. They'd been used as living waste disposal and weapons of terror. The children fed them treats, scratched their chitinous plates, and generally treated them like oversized puppies. The Devourers responded by becoming protective, using their bodies to create shade for the children during the planet's harsh daytime. Finally, they met the Wraiths, phase-shifting predators that could pass through solid matter and were nearly impossible to contain. These were considered the most dangerous of the three species, responsible for countless assassinations and terror attacks. A Wraith could materialize inside your body and tear you apart from within. Governments had tried everything to control them, with minimal success. Sophie approached the first Wraith during its feeding time. The creature was consuming a large animal carcass, its form partially phased so that organs and blood seemed to float in midair around its translucent body. Every adult in the room tensed, ready to pull Sophie back. She walked right up to it and asked if she could watch it eat because it looked really cool. The Wraith fully materialized for the first time in months. It looked at Sophie with multifaceted eyes that reflected her image 100 times. Then it carefully pushed a piece of food toward her. The universal gesture of sharing a meal. Sophie politely declined, explaining she'd already eaten, but thanked the Wraith for being nice. The creature made a sound like wind chimes and gently wrapped one appendage around her shoulders in what xenobiologists later confirmed was a Wraith hug. Within 3 months, the Obsidian Reach was transformed. The three apex predator species, once locked in endless conflict, began cooperating. They'd all experienced the same revelation. These human children saw them as people, not monsters. That recognition unlocked something in their psyches that violence never could. They started communicating, establishing territories through negotiation instead of bloodshed, and even forming mixed species groups. The client species that had suffered under the predator's conflicts were initially skeptical, but as they watched shardlings protect human children from harsh weather, Devourers carefully transport supplies, and Wraiths phase scout dangerous areas to ensure safety, their perspective shifted. These weren't monsters at all. They just never had a reason to be anything else. Jake Morrison found himself promoted to Admiral, put in charge of the rapidly expanding human-alien relations fleet. His job was to coordinate these first contact missions and ensure that humanity's strange gift didn't get exploited or commercialized. There were already corporations trying to monopolize dragon breeding rights, entertainment companies wanting to film the children with predators, and governments requesting specific predators be pacified for strategic advantage. He shut it all down. What Sophie had started wasn't a tool for profit or military advantage. It was something pure, something that couldn't be corrupted by adult agendas. The children who volunteered did so because they genuinely wanted to help. The moment it became about anything else, it would stop working. The predators would sense the insincerity. Dr. Houch. Hayes's research expanded to include long-term studies. She wanted to know if the behavioral changes in the predators were permanent or if they'd revert to violence once the children left. The results were encouraging. Dragons like Ember maintained their gentle nature even when Sophie wasn't around. They'd learned that there were alternatives to aggression, that social bonds could be as satisfying as dominance. More importantly, they began teaching younger dragons. Ember became a parent, laying eggs that hatched in the station's habitat. Sophie was there for the birth, watching with wonder as tiny dragons emerged. These young ones never knew violence or military training. They grew up with human children as playmates and teachers. They learned games before they learned combat. They understood love before they understood fear. The Vraxian Coalition sent a delegation to formally apologize to the dragons. It was unprecedented, a government asking forgiveness from creatures it had once considered property. The dragons listened through their translators as Vraxian leaders admitted to generations of abuse, exploitation, and cruelty. They acknowledged that fear of these magnificent beings had driven them to commit atrocities. They asked for a chance to build something better. Ancient Scar, speaking for the Dragon Collective, gave an answer that was broadcast across the galaxy. The dragons forgave the Vraxians because Sophie had taught them that everyone deserved a second chance. Even species that had done terrible things could change if someone showed them kindness first. The dragons would work with the Vraxians to create a new society, one built on partnership instead of domination. Sophie, watching the broadcast with her mother, asked a simple question. Why hadn't they just been nice to each other before? Amy didn't have a good answer. Fear, she supposed. Everyone was so afraid of being hurt that they struck first and asked questions later. It took human children, who didn't know enough to be afraid to show them a better way. The galaxy began to change in fundamental ways. Species reevaluated their relationships with their native predators. Worlds that had hunted them to near extinction started conservation efforts. Military organizations that had weaponized them began decommissioning facilities. It wasn't universal, and it wasn't quick, but it was happening. Sophie's kiss had rippled outward, affecting billions of lives across thousands of worlds. The diplomatic station became a hub for this new movement. Species sent their apex predators to interact with human children, to experience the transformation firsthand. A waiting list developed, years long, of civilizations hoping to heal their relationships with the creatures they'd feared. Jake had to establish protocols, screening processes, and extensive safety measures even though no incident had yet occurred. Earth's government initially tried to control the narrative, to claim credit for humanity's unique gift. But the truth was obvious to anyone paying attention. This wasn't planned or designed. It was just who humans were, especially young ones. Every child who met a predator had the same instinct, to approach with curiosity and kindness. It couldn't be taught because it was already there, hardwired into human nature. Sophie's 6th birthday party was attended by representatives from 40 different species, 12 dragons including Ember, 3 reindeers, 2 shardlings, a devourer, and 5 wraiths. The predators wore party hats and played musical chairs with a gentleness that would have seemed impossible a year ago. They'd become part of Sophie's extended family, protective guardians who'd die before letting harm come to her or any child. Ambassador Krell presented Sophie with a gift from the Vraxian Coalition. It was a crystal that contained the genetic patterns of every dragon species. He explained that they wanted her to have it, to remember that she'd saved not just individual creatures, but entire lineages from extinction through abuse. Sophie thanked him politely, then asked if the dragons could have some cake because it wasn't fair if only the people got treats. Watching the apex predators of a dozen worlds carefully eating birthday cake with children climbing over them, Jake understood that this was humanity's true contribution to the galaxy, not weapons or technology or resources. They'd given the universe permission to be gentle. They'd shown that strength didn't require violence, that power could be used for protection instead of domination. And they'd done it through the simplest means possible: a child's kiss on a dragon's nose. The galaxy would never be the same. Fear had ruled for millennia, but Sophie had started something that couldn't be stopped. One by one, worlds were learning that monsters were just people who'd never been loved. And humanity, with its bizarre willingness to love the unlovable, was teaching the universe how to heal. 18 months after Sophie kissed Ember, the Galactic Council voted to establish the Apex Predator Rights and Protection Act. It was the first legislation to grant full sapient rights to nonverbal species based solely on their capacity for emotional bonding and social complexity. The dragons, renders, shardlings, devourers, and wraiths were recognized as people under galactic law. They could own property, file grievances, and participate in governance through appointed representatives. The Vaxian Coalition led the charge, sponsoring the legislation with support from humanity and 70 other species. The debate was fierce. Conservative factions argued that granting rights to creatures bred for war would destabilize military organizations across the galaxy. How could you maintain order if your weapons had legal recourse? How could you fight wars if your soldiers could refuse orders? That was exactly the point. The galaxy was being forced to reckon with uncomfortable truths. If these predators were sapient beings capable of love and choice, then centuries of military doctrine had been built on slavery. The economic implications alone were staggering. Entire industries collapsed overnight as predator exploitation became illegal. Jake Morrison testified before the council, with Sophie sitting beside him. She'd been invited as an expert witness, though the title felt absurd for a 6-year-old. But she was, arguably, the galaxy's foremost authority on apex predator behavior. She'd spent more time with them than most xenobiologists. She understood them in ways that scientific analysis couldn't capture. When asked to explain her methods, Sophie's answer was characteristically simple. She said that the dragons and other creatures just wanted someone to be nice to them. They got angry because everyone was mean and scared. But if you showed them you weren't scared and you liked them, they'd be nice back. It was the same as making friends at school. The council representative from the Kelthax Union, whose species had lost thousands to Vraxian dragon attacks, demanded to know how Sophie could dismiss that suffering. How could she ask them to forgive creatures that had destroyed their worlds? Sophie looked up at the towering alien with those fearless eyes and asked if the dragons had wanted to do those things or if someone made them. The question hung in the chamber like an accusation, because that was the truth nobody wanted to examine. The dragons hadn't chosen to be weapons. They'd been taken as eggs, raised in isolation, tortured into aggression, and forced into combat. Every attack, every casualty, every destroyed world had been orchestrated by people who used the dragon's power for their own ends. The predators were victims as much as anyone else. The legislation passed by a narrow margin. Predator rights became law. Enforcement would take decades, but the foundation was set. Species had to begin dismantling their predator exploitation systems. Military organizations had to transition to voluntary service models where apex predators could choose whether to fight. Breeding programs had to prioritize welfare over combat effectiveness. Earth became the center of this transformation. Human psychologists, animal behaviorists, and child development specialists found themselves in high demand across the galaxy. Everyone wanted to understand how humans had developed this unique approach to predator relations. Universities created entire departments dedicated to studying human-predator bonding patterns. Dr. Patricia Hayes led a massive research initiative spanning 30 worlds. Her team documented every instance of human-predator interaction they could find, building a comprehensive database of behavioral patterns. What they discovered challenged evolutionary biology's core assumptions. Humans weren't an anomaly. They were what happened when a species prioritized social bonding over individual survival. Human evolution had taken a unique path. Instead of developing better weapons or stronger bodies, humanity had invested in cooperation. They'd learned to read emotions, to empathize with other species, to form pack bonds that transcended genetic similarity. That trait, combined with their children's fearlessness, made them perfectly suited for apex predator rehabilitation. Other species tried to replicate it. They sent their own children to interact with predators hoping for similar results. Sometimes it worked, but more often it didn't. The difference was subtle but crucial. Human children approached predators with genuine curiosity and affection. Other species young, even when trained to hide their fear, couldn't fully mask the instinctive terror that apex predators triggered. The predators sensed it and responded accordingly. Amy Chen's Human-Dragon Relations Unit expanded to include specialists in every known apex predator species. They developed training programs, safety protocols, and interaction guidelines. But the core principle remained Sophie's original approach. Treat them like people you want to be friends with. Everything else was just details. The backlash was inevitable. Military hardliners from multiple species formed a coalition opposing the new legislation. They argued that apex predators were too dangerous to be given freedom, that the only safe predator was a controlled one. They pointed to incidents where predators had killed their handlers, conveniently ignoring that those incidents occurred in facilities still using violent training methods. The opposition found an unlikely target: Sophie herself. Political commentators from the Zalkarian Empire criticized humanity for using children as diplomatic tools. They claimed Sophie had been manipulated by her government, that no child would willingly approach deadly creatures without coercion. The accusations were absurd to anyone who knew Sophie, but they gained traction in regions where human behavior remained mysterious. Jake found himself defending his daughter on galactic news feeds. He showed footage of Sophie at home, playing with Ember during supervised visits, teaching young dragons to paint, reading stories to renders who'd curl around her like living blankets. There was no manipulation, no forcing. If anything, he and Amy had to set limits on how much time Sophie spent with the predators because she'd live in their habitats if they let her. The controversy reached a crisis point when the Zalkarian government demanded Sophie appear before their tribunal to answer questions about human intentions. They framed it as a fact-finding mission, but everyone knew it was political theater designed to discredit the apex predator rights movement. The Galactic Council couldn't ignore the request without appearing biased, even though sending a 6-year-old to hostile interrogation was clearly inappropriate. Sophie's response, delivered through a carefully worded statement her parents helped her write, became famous across the galaxy. She said she'd be happy to talk to anyone who wanted to understand why she liked the dragons and other creatures. She didn't understand why people thought it was weird to be nice to them. They were just animals who needed friends. If the Zalkarian people wanted to learn how to make friends with scary things, she'd be happy to teach them. Maybe they had scary creatures on their world who needed hugs too. The statement's innocent sincerity made the Zalkarian tribunal look petty and vindictive. Public opinion swung sharply in Sophie's favor. Protests erupted on Zalkarian worlds, citizens demanding their government stop bullying a human child. Within a week, the Zalkarians withdrew their request and issued a formal apology. The opposition movement lost momentum as more incidents of predators choosing gentleness over violence went viral across galactic media. Ember became the face of the apex predator rights movement. The dragon participated in public appearances, speaking through translators about life before and after Sophie. Ember described the isolation, the fear, the constant pain of training designed to maximize aggression. Then came the day a small human touched with kindness instead of cruelty, and everything changed. Ember had learned that there were alternatives to violence, that social bonds could be as satisfying as any instinct. Other predators added their voices. Ancient Scar spoke at the council, its words translated into a dozen languages. The elder dragon described generations of suffering, of watching young ones broken by training regimens that killed their spirits before their bodies. The dragons had believed they deserved this treatment, that they were inherently evil and needed to be controlled. Sophie taught them they were wrong. They weren't monsters. They were people who'd never been allowed to be anything else. The movement expanded beyond apex predators. Species began reevaluating their treatment of all animals used for military or industrial purposes. If dragons deserved rights, what about the Crescian sandworms used to terraform hostile worlds? What about the Pelthian swarms used for mining operations? The ethical implications rippled across every sector of galactic civilization. Sophie's 7th birthday marked 2 years since she'd kissed Ember. The anniversary became an unofficial holiday in the Vraxian Coalition and several other systems. They called it Unity Day, celebrating the moment when fear gave way to friendship. Schools taught about it. Children across multiple species drew pictures of Sophie and Ember, capturing the moment that changed the galaxy. Dr. Hayes published her final report on the human-predator bonding phenomenon. After 2 years of exhaustive study, her conclusion was simple. Humans succeeded because they genuinely cared. There was no trick, no special technique, no hidden advantage. They just treated predators like they mattered, and that basic respect was something no other species had thought to try. The report ended with a recommendation that other species focus less on replicating human methods and more on developing their own capacity for compassion toward creatures they traditionally feared. The galactic economy adapted to the new reality. Predator welfare became a major industry. Former exploitation facilities converted to rehabilitation centers. Veterans of predator handling programs sought therapy for trauma inflicted and received during their service. It was messy and expensive, but it was also necessary. The galaxy was healing from centuries of normalized violence. Back on the diplomatic station, Sophie's life had found a new normal. She attended school with human and alien children, played with predators during supervised visits, and generally existed as a regular kid who happened to be famous across 50 star systems. She didn't think of herself as special. She'd just been nice to Ember, and apparently that was a big deal to grown-ups. Ember had become something like a guardian to Sophie. The dragon accompanied her to school functions, laid protectively nearby during her medical checkups, and generally acted like an oversized, scaly parent. The bond between them deepened daily. They'd developed their own communication system that went beyond words. A mixture of gestures and vocalizations that let them understand each other perfectly. Lieutenant Amy Chin watched her daughter interact with the galaxy's deadliest creatures and marveled at how normal it had become. 2 years ago, the idea of children playing with dragons would have been insane. Now, it was just another day. Human kids and apex predators from a dozen worlds played together in specially designed habitats supervised by xenobiologists and child psychologists who were still figuring out the best practices. The breakthrough came when they realized the predators weren't just tolerating the children.
They were actively protecting them.
A render had once detected a gas leak in a habitat before sensors could, immediately wrapping its body around the children to shield them while phasing through walls to find the source. A shardling had created a sonic barrier to deflect debris when a meteor struck a station's outer hull. The predators had become genuine guardians, their protective instincts focused on the small humans who'd shown them kindness. Jake Morrison stood in the observation deck, watching his daughter teach a young dragon how to play chess. The dragon was winning, much to Sophie's delight. She'd never been competitive, more interested in playing with friends than beating opponents. That attitude had changed the galaxy more effectively than any weapon humanity could have designed. The human government finally understood the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just about predator rights or military disarmament. This was a fundamental shift in how civilizations approached power and conflict. Humanity had shown that strength didn't require violence, that the galaxy's most dangerous creatures could choose peace if given the option. It was a lesson that every species needed to learn. The Galactic Council announced plans for the first interspecies Harmony Station, a facility dedicated to predator rehabilitation and human-alien cooperation. It would be 10 times larger than the diplomatic station, capable of housing hundreds of predators and thousands of human volunteers. Construction would take 5 years, but the project represented a commitment to the principles Sophie had demonstrated. The galaxy was choosing a different path forward. Sophie celebrated her 7th birthday with Ember at her side, surrounded by friends both human and alien, predator and prey. She made a wish as she blew out the candles, though she wouldn't tell anyone what it was. But Jake suspected he knew. She wanted everyone to have friends like she had, for every creature to know that someone cared about them. It was a big wish, maybe too big. But if the last 2 years had taught him anything, it was that impossible dreams had a way of coming true when approached with enough innocence and determination. The galaxy's deadliest dragon leaned down and gently nuzzled the small human who'd changed everything. Sophie laughed and hugged Ember's massive head. 2 years ago, that moment would have been unthinkable. Now it was just a little girl and her best friend, celebrating another year of life in a galaxy that was finally learning what it meant to choose love over fear.